Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. Tonight is an interesting night. We had our usual room in the Founders Room upstairs reserved, and we had such a strong demand that we had to get this our room here on the first floor. So we're very grateful we could accommodate everybody. July 20th, 1787. The Constitutional Convention was debating whether to subject the president to impeachment. Benjamin Franklin won the day, arguing that impeachment was a civilized substitute for tyrannicide. Presidential wars are the ultimate tyranny, the greatest of all high crimes and misdemeanors. Franklin taught, quote, "There is never a good war or a bad peace. War legitimizes murder and is mankind's worst scourge. In times of war, the law falls silent. Our rights are tossed to the wind. Freedom of speech, transparency, and due process." Abraham Lincoln explained why the Constitution entrusts the war power exclusively to Congress, and I quote, "Kings had always been impoverishing their people in wars, pretending that the good of the people was their goal, and our founders understood that war to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and they resolved to frame the Constitution so that no one man holds the power of bringing this oppression upon us." Close quote. In December 2007, then Senator Joe Biden well understood this pillar of the Constitution. Senator Biden literally shrieked at Chris Matthews on Hardball that he would move heaven and earth to impeach President George W. Bush if he attacked Iran without a declaration of war. There is nothing new under the sun. Power corrupts, and our absolute power corrupts absolutely. President Joe Biden has unconstitutionally made the United States a co-combatant with Israel against Iran by deploying troops in Israel to operate our THAAD missile defense system, all in anticipation of an Israeli attack on Iran with American weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic support. Under his own standard, Biden should be impeached and removed from office. Were this to happen, his successors would think twice before launching a new war. As you know only too well, presidents have usurped the congressional war power with impunity since the Korean War. Impeachable offenses don't earn immunity, though, by repetition. Ending presidential wars is long overdue. We must rescue the United States from self-ruination. If not us, who? If not now, when? We dare not fail to try. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, John. Before I speak, I'm always reminded of Samuel Johnson's quip about John Milton's Paradise Lost. Despite its dazzle, none ever wished it were longer. So brevity is the soul of wit. If it's the right thing to do, do it. That precept is the alpha and omega of civilization. Without it, we would still be living as savages. Josh Paul did the right thing because it was the right thing to do 11 days after October 7th, 2023. Josh jettisoned a glittering career at the State Department, including 11 years in the Bureau of Military Political Affairs. because it was defiling the rule of law and cruelly indifferent to the industrial scale slaughter of defenseless Palestinians in Gaza with $18 billion of U.S. weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic support. Now, Josh wrote in his resignation letter, "We cannot be against occupation and for it. We cannot be for freedom and against it. We cannot be for making the world a better place and yet contributing to making it worse." In other words, the State Department had become like the devil quoting scripture. Now, Josh had promised that he would leave when he knew he was doing more harm than good. And he explained, "I'm leaving today because I believe our current course with regard to the continuation and indeed the enlargement and expedition of the provision of lethal arms to Israel I have reached the end of that bargain." Now, Josh's profile in Courage inspired a dozen or more copycat resignations. Now, think of that. It's an amazing achievement amidst an amoral, multi-trillion-dollar military-industrial security complex where mindlessly following orders, we understand the following orders defense, is standard operating procedure. Things have worsened beyond imagination in the year that has elapsed since October 7th. Mass starvation stalks Gaza. Babies get death certificates before birth certificates. Think of that. Death certificates before birth certificates. The war has expanded from Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and now Iran. Consumer items like pagers and walkie-talkies have been turned into instruments of war crimes. The United States has become a co-combatant with Israel in its anticipated war against Iran, but of course without a congressional declaration. Blowback lurks over the horizon. Israel is clueless other than killing for the sake of killing. They have no envy. Josh's resignation was not in vain. The world is a better place because of what he did, what he inspired, and what he continues to do. We are ennobled and honored by his presence this evening. If there were a Mount Rushmore of courage, Josh would be its centerpiece. But let us pause briefly before we begin. Let us pause briefly before we begin. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what we do or fail to do hereafter. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bruce, for those very kind introductions. Before I get into what I want to say, I do want to respond to two quick points there. The first is to say, I think particularly given that today is the eve of St. Crispin's Day, that when it comes to the others who have resigned, I don't know that I would say copycats. I would say each, in their own way, has stood up for justice from where they sat and from where they were working. Each are compelling voices, whether from the US military, the US State Department, the White House, the Interior Department, the Department of Education, all the places that they have left. And I would encourage you to hear their voices as well, because they each have a very compelling story to tell. And then the second nit I want to pick very quickly, just with something that John said, quoting Benjamin Franklin, that any peace is a good peace. And we'll come to that, because I think that that's the events sort of certainly prior to this year showed that it is not the case that any peace is a good peace. Peace without justice, for example, is not a good peace. But what I'd like to do is just back up a little bit. For those of you who I haven't met, just say very quickly a little bit more about the context from which I resigned. And then, we're here to talk about, as you so beautifully framed it, and as the invitation framed it, entangling alliances, right? Going back to George Washington, this nation has been warned of the risks of entangling alliances, of what happens when our foreign policy, our interests, are sublimated to the interests of others. Yes, alliances are critical to America in this day, as much as in any other, if not more. And yet, there are alliances of equals, there are alliances of interests, and there are alliances that subvert interest. And I do fear that that is what we are talking about when we are talking about today's relationship between the United States of America and Israel. So I'd like to talk briefly about my own resignation, give a quick history there, right, of that relationship between the United States and Israel, and then speak to my own experience, which I think, what I will describe, I think are greatly the symptoms of that entangling alliance, the symptoms of the problems we face. And then perhaps we can wrap up with a brief discussion of why we face those problems. So, as was mentioned, just over a year ago, I resigned from the State Department from something called the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. For those of you who aren't deeply familiar, this is the part of the US government that is responsible for our security relationships with partners, for security assistance, and for arms transfers. There's a reason that it is in the State Department, right? Most people, when they hear of this function, they immediately think of the Defense Department. But in fact, since the time of the Marshall Plan, the United States has seen these as tools of foreign policy. When we provide assistance to a foreign country to build their security capacity, to defend themselves, these are tools of influence and leverage for the United States, if we are willing to use them as such. So I worked in that bureau for, as Bruce mentioned, about 11 years, raising concerns, I would say, during my time there on a host of countries, because of course the United States has complex relationships with a large number of what we might call complex countries. And it had been my experience for some time that the State Department, to a great extent, is actually designed for debate, is designed to enable discussion when we disagree about policy, to lift up voices from the Human Rights Bureau, from the regional bureaus, and to facilitate that sort of discussion. And it had been my experience that I'd gone in, I'd worked in the department under President Obama, under President Trump, under President Biden, and just maybe a starting point for our discussion today, as it had been a starting point for my discussion with senior officials under each of those administrations, I would go in and I'd say, I would like to raise some concerns with you. I work on security assistance, on arms transfers. Can we talk about our arms transfers to Saudi Arabia? And the answer was yes, absolutely. This is something of concern. We have interests, but we also have values. We need to balance them. What can we do? Can I talk to you about our relationship with, for example, Duterte's Philippines, President Duterte's Philippines? Yes, of course. No, we're very concerned by the use of extrajudicial killings to silence repression. We should talk about that. Can I talk to you about Israel? Well, that wasn't quite the response, but not far off, right? The answer was, well, that's one I really don't think I can touch. It's just too sensitive, and we're not going to get anything else done. So no, I'll talk to you about Saudi. I'll talk to you about the Philippines. I won't talk to you about Israel. So all of this is to say that this is sort of the circumstance in which we find ourselves. But I think it's important to note that it hasn't always been the case, right? The US relationship with Israel is a changing relationship. And if you go back to 1948, and I don't need to tell all of you the lengthy history here, but just to run through quickly, right? At Israel's founding, we didn't know if it would fall into the Soviet bloc or the Western bloc. In fact, Israel's War of Independence in 1948, it fought with Soviet bloc weapons, mostly with Czech weapons. In 1956, when Israel partnered with the UK and France in their initiative to seize the Suez Canal, it was, of course, President Eisenhower who stepped in and threatened the credit of the UK and France and ended that adventurism. Even 1967, when Israel in the Six-Day War conquered the West Bank, Gaza, and at that point the Sinai as well. That was almost entirely with French and British weaponry at that time. It was only after that, under President Johnson's tenure originally, that the relationship began to warm or become really close. It wasn't until 1973, during the October War, the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was under attack from the United Arab Republic, from the north, from the south, that they turned to the United States and urgently requested arms. And President Nixon's original response was basically, meh. And it wasn't until Henry Kissinger walked into Nixon's office and said, in that gravelly voice I won't even try to replicate, Mr. President, this is a Cold War issue, we need to come to Israel's support. That, the relationship essentially was born in its modern form. The US provided, through Operation Nickelgrass, what was at the time the largest ever, and actually until 2 years ago, the largest ever provision of security assistance to a partner, only recently surpassed in the last couple of years by our assistance to Ukraine. And it was also, by the way, in the 1970s, that Congress, for the first time, took an interest in this relationship, and for the first time passed a law relating to Israel's qualitative military edge. Can I just see, how many of you have heard of QME, of qualitative military edge? I see about 6, 7, 8 hands. So, and that's typical, right? You're actually doing pretty well, because not many people know that it is written into United States law, and it still is to this day, as amended last in 2014, that the United States, in all its security relationships and arms transfers to the Middle East, must ensure that Israel's qualitative military edge is protected to the extent that it can defend itself against any country, group or countries, or non-state actors while sustaining minimal damage. That is the law of the United States, and originating in the 70s. Even through the 80s, I think we still see a US willingness to use leverage, right? President Reagan famously, 14 hours into the bombardment of Beirut, calls up then Prime Minister Begin and says, if you continue your bombardment, I will tell you 2 things will be true. The first is that the world's image of Israel will be that of a baby with its legs blown off, because that was indeed the photo on the front pages of the newspapers on that day. And secondly, the United States will have to fundamentally revisit the nature of its relationship with Israel. And of course, here we are now, over 12 months into the onslaught on Gaza, and one cannot imagine President Biden picking up the phone and making a similar call. So this is all to say that it has not always been as it is now. And that does give me hope that it will change, that there are, as they say, lasting interests, not necessarily lasting alliances. And I do believe that there is a cost that we are now paying in our alliance, in our unconditional support for Israel around the world, that will, I think, make itself clearer and clearer and make a re-evaluation of our current policies more and more important. But before we get to that, so I also want to talk very quickly about how that US role manifests itself right now, and what I saw in the State Department in terms of how that plays out. So briefly, and I'd like to go back a little bit here too. So prior to working in the State Department for the last 11 years until last year, I had worked in various capacities, in various roles in the national security sector, in the Pentagon, on the Hill, and overseas. I did a couple of tours in Iraq for the State Department and for the Defense Department, and also spent 14 months living in Ramallah in the West Bank for an organization called the US Security Coordinator. This is a US-led multinational team. Americans, Brits, Canadians, Turkey has a representative in there, a number of other countries, whose role is essentially to build Palestinian security force capacity, on the theory that as the Palestinian security forces stand up, the Israelis will stand down, you can get to a 2-state solution. I hear someone already laughing over there. Right. I mean, so the fact is that it was my experience, certainly in 2008, 2009, that actually the Palestinians were really standing up. The Palestinian security forces were quite effective. The problem was twofold. The problem was, first of all, that the Israelis never stood down. But the problem as well was that the Palestinian security forces were standing up not for the Palestinian people, but for Israel. They were standing up to show Israel that they could be trusted with the security of Israel. How does that manifest itself? So, I had this, lovely apartment in Ramallah where I looked down the valley across the hill to the opposite side, where there was an Israeli settlement and military base that was the headquarters for the COGAT, the Coordinator of Israeli Military Activities in the West Bank. And on a weekly basis, there would be a protest. The Palestinians would come down the hill from Ramallah, the IDF would come rolling out of their base, there'd be tear gas, there'd be maybe some live shots sometimes, and this was the weekly routine. And of course, this intensified at the end of 2008 during what was then Operation Cast Lead, right? This was the first major clash between Israel and Hamas after 2006. And so what I saw sitting there on my balcony, of course, sipping a gin and tonic, as any good diplomat on a balcony in the Middle East does, was the Palestinians come down, the Israelis begin to start rolling out, and then from the side, in comes this line of troops, of forces in their blue police uniforms with, unmarked vehicles, form a line in between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and face towards the Palestinian protesters and push them back. And we wrote back to Washington, to the State Department, to the White House, what a great success. Look at this, the Palestinians really are standing up, the Israelis can stand down. The problem was that very quickly, the Palestinian people themselves lost faith in this process, lost faith in the Palestinian Authority. Graffiti started popping up, calling them, so the head of the USSC at the time was a US General, Keith Dayton, who some of you may know, wonderful man. But calling them Dayton's police was the graffiti on all the walls. And this is symptomatic, I think, of the problem that is at the heart of our current approach, which is that America's role in what it calls the peace process is security for peace, right? The theory that underpins it is if we can provide security so that Israel feels safe, then it will make the concessions necessary for peace. My contention is that what we have done has actually gone so far beyond that, that we have given Israel so much security that it feels that it can build up the walls, it can advance its relationships in the region. Indeed, it can leverage the Palestinian Authority as an implementer of its own occupation, and therefore never has to actually worry about coming to peace. So there are always carrots for one side. For Israel, what can we do to prompt you? How many more weapons do you need? How much more assistance do you need? And always sticks for the other. Now, how does that manifest itself in the State Department, in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs? So starting before October 7th, as I mentioned, I'd been raising for some time prior to last year concerns about the human rights record with Israel. There are a series of laws and policies, right, that apply in the security assistance and arms transfers piece of that. The most famous of them that many of you will have heard of, for example, are the Leahy laws. The Leahy laws, after Senator Pat Leahy, say that we cannot provide military assistance to a unit of the foreign security forces that is credibly alleged to be committing gross violations of human rights. The way this process works for almost every country in the world is that before we provide assistance to a unit of that foreign security force, we vet the unit, sometimes down to the individual level if we're bringing them over here for training. And if there are any red flags in the process, if there are any intelligence reports, if there are any press reports that are credible, any human rights reports, the unit doesn't get the assistance. We go back to the country and say, I'm sorry, red flag, we can't provide assistance to that unit. In the case of Israel, the process is flipped. In the case of Israel, we provide the assistance first, and then we listen out to hear if there are any red flags. And not only that, there's actually a standalone process for Israel called the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum. They created this process uniquely for Israel, in which not only is the process flipped, but there are a few additional steps. So the forum sits, and the reason I'm very familiar with this is I sat on the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum as part of my responsibilities during one of the years I was in the State Department, 2021-22. And as allegations come in of gross violations of human rights, the forum looks at them at the working level, and if they are considered potentially credible, the next step, you pick up the phone to the government of Israel and you say, have you heard about this allegation of gross violation of human rights by your forces? What do you think? Do you think it's credible? Do you have any response? So that's, step one, which is, I think, pretty unique and certainly doesn't happen with any other country. Another step in this process is that if we think there is a credible allegation, it is not simply a matter of raising a flag and then saying, sorry, that unit can't get the assistance. It is actually a decision that has to be made at the very least by the Deputy Secretary of State, if not the Secretary himself. It will surprise none of you to learn that despite what we consider to be a significant number of credible allegations of gross violations of human rights, including torture, rape, extrajudicial killings, no Israeli security force unit has ever been made ineligible under this process or any process for US security assistance. And part of the reason for that, and this sort of comes to my main thesis of the problem, is that at the working level, there was a pressure, there was an identification that these are issues, that these need to be elevated, but we could never get anyone at the political level to sign off on them. We could never get anyone at the political level to do what is needed under this process, to take the next step, to put their name on a memorandum to the Secretary. Because as soon as you hit people who are Senate confirmed or who are presidential nominees, they recognize, in the words that I've heard many times, that it is career suicide for them to be critical of Israel. So that is clearly part of the problem. Another example in this space is in our engagements with Capitol Hill, right? We in the nominations process itself. So part of my role was to work with senior officials who were being nominated for congressional, for Senate confirmed roles. And I remember with a number of them, but one in particular stands out, who was being nominated to be an Undersecretary of State. And we ran with this person through all the various issues that they might be asked about until we got to Israel, and then said, what do you think of our relationship with Israel? And they quite tongue-in-cheek said, cross my heart, hope to die, Israel is the most important place in the world, and there is nothing I wouldn't do for them. And everyone around the table said, perfect answer, you got it. This, of course, was also an issue in a few more other practical ways, right? In the arms transfer space, where there is always less questioning. And just to give one more pre-October 7th example, in the context of the Memorandum of Understanding that the United States has with Israel, we have a 10-year Memorandum of Understanding on security assistance that says we will give Israel $3.3 billion a year in foreign military financing, plus $500 million a year in Defense Department funding. This was signed in 2016 under then Secretary Clinton. It also has a couple of details in it. It says that it's supposed to ramp down the amount of funding that is used for Israel's procurement from itself. This is money that theoretically is supposed to be used in the United States. And it says that it's not supposed to be used for consumables. If you want to use it for fighter jets, fine. But you're not supposed to use it for example, fuel. And over the course of that 10-year memorandum, of which we are now in year 6, repeatedly Israel has come back and said, yes, I know this is what everyone agreed to, but we'd like to use this for fuel. And repeatedly, the United States has said, well, all right, it's just an agreement, go ahead. In fact, in the supplemental that Congress just passed, which appropriated a further $3.5 billion in foreign military financing, the Secretary of State was given the authority to allow Israel to use all of that on its own procurement. So again, a pattern of walking back. So that gets us to October 7th. My observations at that time were, so already that weekend of October 7th being a Saturday, I think by the Monday, I'd already written to a number of senior officials in the department to flag some concerns. And those concerns were having, we've seen this pattern before. We've seen, these strikes between Israel and Hamas, and we know how many civilians die as a result of them, and we can expect that that number will be far, far greater this time around. So first of all, before we start transferring arms, we should think about that. And second of all, if the plan here is our policy is security for peace, if our policy is premised in ensuring that Israel is secure, clearly our policy is failing, has failed. And we should think about that as well, and whether what we are doing is actually leading to security or peace for anyone, including Israel. I was met with a pretty stony silence on that. I had a couple of people call me up and saying, brave email, but are you sure you wanted to send that? And so, over the course of the days that followed, I watched, and 500 Palestinians were killed, then 1,000, then 1,500, then 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. By the time I left, as Bruce said, it was only 11 days after October 7th, there were 3.5, at least 1,000 Palestinians who had been killed. And in that time, there were a few things that were going on. The first was that the administration's response was, we need to rush more arms to Israel. Anything that Israel requests, you will approve, right? This is unlike the way the arms transfer process works. The way it normally works, a country comes in and the request works its way up. Experts look at it and say, is this right for the region? Is this right for human rights? Is this right for proliferation concerns? And once there's consensus, the case goes up and then it finally gets approved. In this case, the approval was happening before the review. And we were being told, you need to approve these cases. There's no time for review. And any concerns I tried to raise were brushed aside. Sorry, just don't have time. We need to approve. At the same time, the administration was also asking the question, this isn't enough. What more can we do? There'd been a supplemental request for Ukraine funding on the table. And the thought was, what can we add to this? What can we do for Israel? And the White House wrote to the State Department and said, what additional authorities do you need? We all scratched our heads and looked at the law and wrote back to the White House, none, actually. We've got all the authorities we could possibly dream of when it comes to Israel. And they wrote back and said, come up with something, because we need to show that we are going above and beyond. And so just come up with something, even if you don't need it, to show that we are doing all we possibly can. At the same time, there's a congressional role in arms transfers, and we don't need to get into details. But Congress has frequently spoken up and expressed concerns on arms transfers and human rights. And there were a number of congressional officers who had reached out to me personally on, for example, sales to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, sales to Egypt, sales to the Philippines was another example I'd given, right? In this case, those same officers were reaching out to me and saying, why aren't you moving faster? What's taking you guys so long? Why are we getting calls from the Israeli embassy that it's taking hours for their arms sales to be approved? So, faced with those situations, with the massive devastation on Gaza, with what I felt was a broken policy, and with the absence of debate, I made the decision to leave at that point. I felt that there was an important debate that had to be had and that should be had within government. But there was no space to have it within government. The only space to have it was in public. And in order to do that, you have to leave government. And so that's what I did. And I'm sorry to say that a year later, this debate continues, the killing continues, and the harm to America continues. The harm continues to, first of all, our reputation around the world, our credibility, the credibility of our values, of the rules-based order that a generation, or generations, I should say, of Americans since World War II have worked to build for the safety and security of all of us, for our alliances around the world, for the stability of the Middle East, and also for our civil rights and our rule of law here at home. When there are laws that a president feels that they can just ignore, set aside, because it is politically advantageous in their perception to do so, that is a problem not only for the Palestinians, not only for the State Department, that is a problem for all of us. So to give another example, and one that has emerged even more clearly in the last year, the Foreign Assistance Act also, of course, says, as you may have heard, under Section 620I, that if it is made known to the president that a foreign country is restricting the delivery of US-funded humanitarian assistance, we cannot provide assistance to that country. And we know that Israel is restricting the delivery of humanitarian assistance, including US-funded humanitarian assistance to Gaza, because the US government has said it repeatedly. Jake Sullivan said it in February. Samantha Power said it publicly in April. And just 2 weeks ago, Secretaries Blinken and Austin put their names on a letter to the government of Israel that laid out about 15 different ways in which Israel is restricting humanitarian assistance. And yet, even though the law within it provides a waiver for the president to use, no one has triggered Section 620I. We know from public reporting and press reporting that has come out based on internal documents that last April there were papers put forward to the Secretary of State by both the Agency for International Development and the Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees and Migration, saying that 620I should be triggered, that humanitarian assistance is being blocked, and Secretary Blinken chose to ignore those recommendations, the recommendations of the most expert parts of the State Department on this matter, and go straight to Congress and say there is no obstruction right now. So this is a problem. There is also a policy problem. We keep hearing these calls for a ceasefire, and each time it is like, Charlie Brown snatched the football away. We're 90% towards a ceasefire. We're almost there. We just need, this last piece of agreement. Each time, it seems to be snatched away. And the question I think you have to pose is, how many times can you be hoodwinked before you realize that maybe you shouldn't trust? And then of course now we are in a situation, and very close I think to an Israeli strike on Iran, a situation in which the administration has taken this calamity for the last year, this disaster in Gaza, this expansion of conflict, and now is almost seeing it as an opportunity that for a conflict to remake the Middle East, an opportunity for war to bring peace, right? This is a return to the magical thinking of 2003, in which somehow these magical 2,000-pound bombs will take out the leadership in Iran, revolution will follow, and the Middle East will be transformed, and the democracy project can continue. It is unbelievable to me. And so my very final question is, why is all of this? Why is all of this happening? Why is the US thinking so obscurantist and so bizarre when it comes to the broader Middle East? But why does President Biden keep letting the Charlie Brown or let Lucy pull the football away? Why do we keep ignoring our own laws? Why are members of Congress who know better willing to say behind closed doors that they know that our weapons are being used to commit war crimes, as they have said to me, but I can't say that publicly? And why is this system not allowing the expressions of American protesters and American public opinion to register in its political system? And the answer is, at the end of the day, what we have is not a policy problem, it is a political problem. It is a problem of our politics, it is a problem of the particularly political economic incentives provided to our politicians. And until we address it through politics, as problematic, I would say, as the current system we have is, particularly since Citizens United, it is a problem that we are going to be stuck with, and it is a problem that is, again, a threat not only to the lives of the Palestinians and to the interests of America overseas, but also to the interests of Americans here at home, because ultimately it is our politics that it is a problem of more than anyone else's. So thank you all very much for your time, and happy to continue the discussion.
You mentioned prominently, Josh, that the relationship we have kind of is being a satellite to Israel wasn't always that way, certainly 1948, and what has changed. So I want to ask you, what is the impact? Citizens United really was a great boon to AIPAC, because now they could spend limitless money to attack their enemies. Before, I remember Chuck Percy, when he voted for AWACS to Saudi Arabia, was destroyed. That was a small-scale destruction compared to what they did in 2022 elections. So you have that vast amount of money at work. But in addition, I think that the members of Congress also, we don't have J. William Fulbrights, we don't have any real hearings anymore. They don't even enforce their subpoenas. The members of Congress, I remember I was attending a session up at the Capitol Hill Club for freshmen elected in 2022. And it's a huge problem up there. The executive branch defies subpoenas all the time. You don't want to respond. And the U.S. Supreme Court had held for over 100 years that Congress has the power to put executive officials in prison if they flout a subpoena. I said, are you going to use your inherent contempt power? His eyes glazed over. He didn't even know what it was. And so you have the unwillingness of any oversight. And so transparency is out the window. And the executive branch is confident we can do whatever we want, and we'll feed it out to David Ignatius and whatever favorite reporters they have. You know, he'll be an echo chamber because he gets the lead and he read some fancy headline. And so it's very, very hard to provoke the debate that you've described because the members of Congress, well, that's where the money comes from. So we're not saying anything. That's why, in my judgment, candidate Harris won't budge half an inch from what Biden is doing there. You know, maybe the tone of the voice changes, but the substance is all the same. And in light of that, you know, John Mearsheimer and Walt wrote about the Israeli lobby. And Thomas Massey went on Tucker Carlson, and Thomas is a member from Kentucky. He said, every member of Congress, 535 except for him, has a handler from AIPAC. And they talk to the handler before they decide anything else. So how do you get around that kind of massive fortress preventing any real dialogue?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if this. Oh, yes, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Bruce. So I think just before we get to that question of AIPAC, I do want to point out that that's a big part of the picture. I don't think it's the entire picture, right? I think, first of all, we have been in a moment for the last 30 years of American hegemony where essentially we can do stupid stuff around the world and not pay an immense cost for it. And I think we're coming out of that moment now. And we see the cost mounting. But I think part of the reason we've gotten here is that there has been very little cost that we have paid, either domestically or abroad, because of it. Part of it is certainly economic ties, cultural ties, and I don't think those can be written off, and I think those are important. At the same time, you know, so I think that, first of all, AIPAC and organizations like that, and there are, for example, Christians United for Israel, there are a number of organizations in this space, first of all, I think cast a larger shadow than they actually fill. I think there is an intimidation factor that extends beyond their actual reach. That's not to say that there aren't incredibly deep pockets. In fact, just today, I would refer you to a piece on the Intercept website that traces the dollars that AIPAC has spent in this election cycle, and they are indeed significant dollars. At the same time, I think that there is also a fear of AIPAC, for example, coming after you and primarying you, where you have members who don't actually receive AIPAC money still towing the line because they are afraid of what might happen if they don't. Part of the problem there is that there is no one else in those spaces, right? So part of the issue is that AIPAC essentially has, and Kufi and all these organizations have pretty much the run of the land. And there aren't really, at this point, massive and strategic and long-term and effective efforts to push back against them from a different perspective. If I can throw in a quick pitch here for something I'm working on, if you'll forgive me. So last week, I and some colleagues, including another person some of you may know, former US Ambassador Robert Ford, rolled out a new initiative called A New Policy. And this is a 501c4 lobbying organization and a political action committee that is focused on this issue of US policy towards Israel and Palestine on a non-partisan basis, and on the premise that what we are doing is not in the American interest. It is not in line with American values either. And this is not ultimately a question that should be driven by a question of whether we are aligned with Israel or against Israel. This is a question about our own interests, our own values, and that is what ultimately should be driving our foreign policy. So do visit us at www.anewpolicy.org. Anyway, but I would also say, however much AIPAC casts a large shadow, they are a very effective organization. And as much as I am skeptical of how powerful they truly are, I was up in the Senate a few weeks ago. I was having breakfast with a senator in the Senate dining room, and they leaned in and they said, all of the members, all of the senators sitting around us here are terrified of AIPAC. Now, I don't want to give, again, I think that's that casting a larger shadow, and are all senators actually terrified of AIPAC? Probably not. But it does show that there is an effect there, and there is an effectiveness there. And until there are others playing in that space and playing that unfortunate game of money that it takes in American politics these days, I think, whether it is AIPAC or whether it is any big money interest, of which there are many, right, that influence our politics. The historical record, of course, is big tobacco, but big oil, big finance, and in this case, big Israel. This is a structural problem. We can either restructure, change the law, look at that campaign finance reform, or just do a better job of playing in that space. And until we do so, we are where we are.
I think you're exactly right that members of Congress are very skittish, highly risk averse, and so even the tiniest fear that AIPAC might come after them causes them to go into a crouch. But I think that because it can work to our benefit, and I hope you and Miko and others can succeed on this score. I think that if you could have one campaign in one district out of the 435 in the House, you made the campaign about what you said. This is for American interest. That one candidate won, he'd get 200 followers immediately. But it's got to be the right candidate with the right brains and the right understanding. We're not cascading Israel. We just want to have the same relationship as anyone else. The problem is we can't find it. Well, if we even look here, except for rare exceptions, can't find anybody who's not at least 40, 50, 60 years old. The young people, they're on TikTok, they're on this or that. It's amazing. And I can't resist saying, James Madison, he was 25 when he began his legislative career. He was 36 years old when he wrote the U.S. Constitution. 36. Federalist Papers, he wrote Washington's inaugural address, the response. Who 36-year-old is doing that today, and who's going to succeed us in the room?
Thank you very much for being here. It's a privilege hearing you. You've talked about, and I've heard a million times, the notion of career suicide. Can you tell us more about what you're doing now and how you're proceeding and moving forward? I think it's very important for other people.
Yeah, thank you. So, that has been a question for myself and for the over a dozen others who have resigned publicly over this issue in the last year. And I would say that there have been at least 3 times that number who have also left quietly. I think one of the challenges that has faced all of us is that it is difficult to leave a job in this country, as many as you will know, particularly a job that comes with security, with health insurance, with retirement insurance, all this sort of thing. And so I think there are questions that we need to ask ourselves also about the incentive structure that is stacked against leaving work, leaving government work. I think all of us who have left on this issue have been fortunate to have been welcomed into a community of non-government organizations, of activism, of organizing and operations. Some of those people are here today. FCNL, I saw Medea somewhere. There are a number of landing spots, and I have to say there's an organization called the Institute for Middle East Understanding, actually, which was a landing spot for many of us in terms of giving us the opportunity to write about our policy issues. But that said, I think it is tough, and there are not that many opportunities out there. That is one of the reasons that one of the other resignees, Tariq Habash, a Palestinian-American who left the Department of Education as a presidential appointee, and I are founding this new organization to try and tackle the political side of this question. And someone said to us recently, well, what is your definition of success? What does success look like for you? And jokingly, but with some seriousness, what we said to him was, our definition of success is when the US government will hire us back. And and I'm joking in the respect, right, that I don't expect the US government to hire me back, and I don't know that I would want to go back in. But the idea that you can speak on this issue as you could speak on any other issue around the world, and be given a government job, be confirmed by the United States Senate. Final thing on this: the Biden administration came into office, for example, saying that it was going to put human rights at the center of foreign policy, and yet it took over 3 years for the Biden administration to have a confirmed assistant secretary for human rights in the State Department, whose job is to put human rights at the center of foreign policy. Why is that? It is because the person that they nominated for that position had once said something moderately critical of Israel, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee refused to advance her nomination. So there is truth to that career suicide thing, and that is what we need to get at. We need to make it so that this is the same as any other issue that we can discuss in this country, agree or disagree. You don't have to agree, but you have to be able to have the argument and not shut people down for trying to have it.
Universal values, not a nationality. The first Reformed Jewish prayer book eliminated all references to a return to Zion. So Reformed Judaism had abandoned the whole idea of Jews being a separate group, that Judaism was a religion. In 1841, when the first Reform synagogue was opened in Charleston, South Carolina, the rabbi said, "This city is our Jerusalem. This country is our Palestine." Zionism is a movement that was created in the 19th century, largely by Eastern European Jews. They had no idea of the religious freedom that existed in the United States and increasingly in Western Europe. Their idea was, suffering from anti-Semitism, that only the creation of a Jewish state would resolve their problem. A line I've used in a number of my articles is that the Palestinians are the final victims of the Holocaust. Reform Jews and most Jews in the United States opposed Zionism. It was only after the emergence of the Nazis and the mass slaughter of Jews in Europe that American Jews became sympathetic to the creation of a Jewish state. The irony is that the Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust, yet it was their land that was taken from them. And Zionist terrorism, which Israeli historians now refer to as ethnic cleansing drove them out. I just want to read one or two quotes that I think you may not be familiar with to explain the extremism that exists in Israel today. The former chief rabbi of Israel, Obadiah Yosef, compared non-Jews to donkeys. He said non-Jews were born only to serve us. Without that, they have no place in the world, only to serve the people of Israel. Why are Gentiles needed? They will work, they will plow, they will reap. We will sit and eat. That's one quote. Rabbi Abraham Kook, a theologian of the settler movement on the West Bank, who has a religious college in Jerusalem named after him, has said, the difference between a Jewish soul and the souls of non-Jews, all of them in all different levels, is greater and deeper than the difference between a Jewish soul and the souls of non-Jews, is greater and different than that between a human soul and the souls of cattle. I could read a dozen quotes like that. The Jerusalem Report, an Israeli magazine, had a front page cover article several weeks ago saying, Jews are the indigenous population of Palestine. God gave us this land. The current Israeli government's goal is to annex the West Bank, remove the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. In fact, in synagogues around the United States, there's West Bank property is being sold to Jewish Americans in synagogues around the United States. President Biden says he believes in a two-state solution. Prime Minister Netanyahu says there will never be a two-state solution. Zionism says that American Jews are in exile, that Israel is really their homeland. I would argue that Jewish day schools in the United States are really a subversive enterprise. They fly Israeli flags. They teach young people that Israel is really their homeland, that they are in exile in America. This, of course, does not represent the thinking of very many Jewish Americans. Anyway, I'll stop here.
No, thank you. And if I can just say very briefly in response to that, I think it's worth noting that, of course, it has also been Jewish organizations that were amongst the earliest and the most vigorous opponents of what has been happening over the last year. Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now. And I think at the same time, we also have to recognize we are very quick and keen at recognizing religious fanaticism when it occurs in other places. We must also be able and willing to recognize it when it happens in Israel. And indeed, one of the things I always find striking is that the Israeli press itself reports far more clearly and with far more clarity on that fanaticism than our own press does when reporting about Israel.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for a wonderful presentation. I'm Helena Cobb, and I'm the president of Just World Educational.
our organization has recently released a book that I co-authored with Rami Khouri under the title Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And the book is actually, well, it's a wonderful book, of course, but it's a radical, thank you, a radical appeal for effective diplomacy in an era in which our government seems to have laid aside or deliberately killed effective diplomacy. So anyway, come up afterwards if you want to learn more about the book. My question is about the way you portray the relationship between our government and the government of Israel, where it seems that what you're saying is that the government of Israel is kind of taking our government for a ride. There are other ways of looking at this. I mean, several people that I really respect in West Asia say, actually, you know, it's the US that is the head of the snake, or the, you know, the head of the dog, and Israel has just been doing its bidding, has been the attack dog for US imperialism in West Asia for so long. And maybe just recently, the Rottweiler has slipped the leash, or maybe, you know, our president has let go of the leash, but that it's actually, that's the nature of the relationship. How do you see it, like tail versus dog?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think historically, right, if we look at that historical record, there was certainly a significant period for which Israel was a tool of American interest, right, particularly in the Cold War context, where it was, you know, the beachhead against Soviet expansion, and, you know, of course, the Soviets backed the United Arab Republic, which was Syria and Egypt, and the Camp David Accords were constructed around not only bringing peace between Israel and Egypt, but also bringing Egypt into the Western camp. You know, I think it's hard to make that same argument now, and I think that we are, you know, a question I have often asked and never really received a satisfactory response on is, what is the net strategic benefit that the United States is getting out of this relationship right now? And the answer I typically get to that is, well, Israel is a great partner on counterterrorism and on intelligence sharing. And the question back, though, is, yes, but aren't they also the cause of most of that counterterrorism and intelligence sharing that we're working with them on addressing? So, you know, I think it is hard to point right now to a net strategic benefit to the United States from this relationship. I think it's quite easy to point to a net strategic benefit for Israel from this relationship with the United States, at least as seen from Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective. I actually don't happen to think that what we are doing, for that matter, having said it's not in Palestine's interest or America's interest, I also don't think it's in Israel's interest. I think we are helping them dig themselves deeper and deeper into a very ugly hole. But you know, I think that there is, from their perspective, when it comes to supply of arms, when it comes to regional diplomatic support, when it comes to intelligence sharing, when it comes to economic ties, that there are clear net benefits there. And so that would make me think that at this point in our relationship, it is you know, being driven, you know, both by you know, Israel's interests as Israel represents them, and by this sort of, you know, systematic challenge that we have in American politics, in which our own interests can be subverted by a well-constructed effort to do so.
I can't resist making these observations. Number one, it's kind of odd if Israel's doing our bidding. You walk down the corridors of the House and Senate office buildings, there are more Israeli flags than U.S. flags. We have members of Congress, they're dressed in the IDF uniform on the House floor. And we invite Prime Minister Netanyahu, he addresses a joint session of Congress. He gets 55 standing ovations. Our president could never get that.
Our president doesn't have support from both parties, so that's the bipartisan support.
And the last is, at least in the Israeli Knesset, they can talk about Israel's nuclear weapons. In the United States, we have a rule. No public official can insinuate Israel has nuclear weapons. Now, that doesn't sound to me like we are manipulating them. It sounds the reverse.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. thank you for this event. Again, thanks for your courage. I think it takes a lot of courage, like you're saying, to leave a job, a career path in front of you. Can you talk about the role of the media? We talked about the lobby, the money in politics, and all of that. How members of Congress are scared, and all of. I work in media. I'm a journalist, analyst, and the way the media covers this conflict, this whole issue, American media, and by extension, I would say global English-speaking media at least. Well, better in Europe, but just talking about the American media. What is the role of the American media? The sort of bias for one side or against the other, and how that shapes the public opinion of the American public, that then plays back into how the lobby and the money and all of that works. And then quickly, another question is, what do you see as a path to do the reverse, like the Arab American community, Muslim American community here in the U.S.? A lot of people know this is wrong and they want to change it. What's the path forward? How to change this broken system? Certainly, it's not in the national interest of the United States. It's not what most Americans want, but how to change it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So on the media, I mean, look, my perspective is that there is a skewing of the media towards the Israeli perspective. I think that comes from a number of different sources, right? One of those is the question simply of access. That reporters go, when they go to report on Israel, they live in Tel Aviv, they make friends with the people there. There are no Western reporters right now reporting out of Gaza. There haven't been, except for a couple of minor sort of trips they've taken in, escorted by the IDF, with one exception, throughout this conflict. True, I want to make clear there are some amazing Palestinian reporters in Gaza, but the Western media have also made the choice, by and large, not to magnify their voices because, quote unquote, they can't be trusted, while at the same time we give full airtime to IDF spokespeople and all that sort of thing. But part of it is access and perspective. Part of it, my experience, and I've talked to a lot of press over the course of the last year, and I've had this conversation with them, including many Western press, and I have to say there's been some wonderful reporting done. I don't think the problem is the reporters. I think the problem is the editors and the publishers, who are very conscious of how their headlines will be perceived, and of the story selection and how their wording matters. We've seen these reports, for example, of the New York Times guide that went out that said, here are the words you can use, here are the words you can't use. BBC has the same thing. And so, and I think a factor there, which comes back to the question of organizing and of lobbies, I was talking to the editor of one national outlet who said, every time we say anything critical of Israel, we get 100 phone calls the next day from people around the country, and each of those has to go to our ombudsman, and the ombudsman has to look into each of them, and it's a pain in the ass, so we're very careful there. Whenever we say something that is critical of the Palestinian side, no one picks up the phone. So there is also a problem where this is also, this perception of where people have to stand and what they can say is actively being stoked by organizations that exist to do that, and there just there isn't a balance of organizations. So that's part of the problem as well. And then very quickly on your second part of your question, which, how do we fix this? I mean, so, look, I think that, first of all, we have to recognize that there are now 100 members of Congress who've called for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. That is not nothing. It's still 20% of Congress, but it's not nothing. If you had told me, a year ago that a group of members of Congress would have written a letter to the president insisting that lethal arms transfers to Israel be stopped, I would have been surprised. If you told me that one of the signers of that letter would be Nancy Pelosi, I would not have believed you. And yet here we are. And to be honest, I think the factor that is making the biggest difference right now is the unavoidability, the visibility of Israel's violations. They, I think, by their own actions, are driving this shift more than anything else. At the same time, I think that there are clear opportunities and clear ways to, build a path forward, and part of that is, unfortunately, working in the campaign finance space and on lobbying and all this sort of organizing. I think that's just one lane. I think that there are many lanes that need to be energized, and there are we have to also be out on the streets, all that kind of thing. I think the student protests have also demonstrated that the youth are going in another direction. And that actually ties back, sorry, to your media question, because if you look at the divergence in views, all of American public opinion is shifting, but it's shifting the furthest and the fastest in the youth. And I suspect a big reason for that is that they aren't getting their news from CNN and Fox and ABC. They're getting their news from TikTok or Instagram or whatever it might be, where they get a much more unfiltered, for better or for worse, because there's clearly a worse there as well, but for better or for worse, and that's a factor here as well when we're talking about the media. Um, but I do think that organizing and finally also bringing this issue into the American mainstream, right? So the American mainstream right now is basically unconditional support for Israel, but it is now increasingly aware of the Palestinian people and of their humanity. I was talking to someone who's Palestinian American today, who told me twice in the last 2 days he has had people come up to him, and he had his Amazon delivery person who saw a Palestinian flag on the back wall, said, "Oh, are you Palestinian?" And he said yes, and the delivery man broke into tears. And so I think that there is an opportunity now to take this framing into the mainstream, to talk about how what we are doing is not in anyone's interest, and to bring this conversation beyond just the deeply affected communities that are the Arab American communities, the Muslim American communities, and recognize that we are all getting deeply affected by this. And I think that's how we change things.
Josh, thank you so much. Your profile and courage. I have actually one question for you and one question for you, Bruce, if that's all right. I'll keep it brief. We count now 130 members more calling for conditions on weapons to Israel. We know that there's a Senator Sanders, Schatz, Merkley, Welch effort right now to force a vote to block some of these weapons that were notified in August. Joint direct attack munitions, 120 millimeter rounds, and was wondering if you could say something about that, maybe the importance of that vote, and how our communities here can amplify that. And Bruce, I was wondering if you could go a little bit deeper into the war powers implications of the THAAD deployment and maybe some of the levers, because really the administration's not listening, and Congress is a lever that we have both on the weapons and the war powers.
I'm so glad you directed the war powers question towards Bruce. So there is a mechanism under law by which Congress can block arms sales. I think this opens us up into a much broader structural discussion. It's called a joint resolution of disapproval. Just to note that at no point since the Arms Export Control Act passed in 1976 has a joint resolution of disapproval ever stopped an arms sale from going forward, because it has passed, because it requires a veto-proof majority in both the House and the Senate. And that is a problem, I think, that all of us can look at, even if we're not only talking about Israel, but that Congress sort of gave itself this toothless tool and has been unable to use it. There was actually a bipartisan bill 2 years ago, sponsored by Senators Murphy, Lee, and Sanders, I believe it was, Mike Lee of Utah, that would actually flip the script and for most countries require a positive vote of Congress before we provide a major arms sale, rather than a 2/3 majority against it. And that's something that we should be thinking about. On these sales, on these joint resolutions of disapproval, they are likely to be coming up for a vote in November. I think that it is important that we speak up and call on senators, this is a Senate vote, to support these resolutions. I think we can be acknowledging that, we're not going to get 2/3 of the Senate, let alone all of Congress. But I think it is an important moment to show again that the conversation is shifting, and that where in January there were 11 senators who would vote for a resolution calling on the State Department to report on Israel, on its human rights practice. In February, there were 17 members of the Senate who were willing to advance an amendment forcing the administration to report to Congress again in what became a National Security Memorandum, ultimately, National Security Memorandum 20, when President Biden took it off the Senate floor. This is an opportunity to show that that number is growing. So if we can get to 20, if we can get to 25, I think that will be a real success here.
Let me, before I respond directly, comment about the importance of communicating sentiments directly to government. You have a right to petition for redress of grievances. And I remember vividly right now the October Saturday Night Massacre with Richard Nixon. You remember that when I professed at Harvard Law School, Archibald Cox had subpoenaed tapes of the White House that would show, arguably, that he was implicated in obstructing justice. And as a consequence, he wanted a senile old senator, John Stennis. He could hardly hear, but he was going to monitor the tapes instead of Archibald Cox to decide whether there's anything incriminating, and that was ruled out. And so Richard Nixon then ordered the firing of Archibald Cox. And he said he wasn't going to obey the Court of Appeals decision saying he had to turn over the White House tapes. But I remember the next day, there are like 1 million telegrams from Americans to the White House. Said, that's totally unacceptable. You must obey. And on Monday morning, Nixon said, we're obeying the court order. Richard Nixon did that. Similar. In 2013, Barack Obama went to the House and Senate and said, I want a declaration of war against Syria because they've used chemical weapons. He said, against the rebels, the insurrectionists, however you wanted to label them. Senate and House got thousands of calls, all against, no, we are not going to declare war. He couldn't even get a bill out of committee. Not even out of committee because of that public interest in invocation. This is recently as 2013. So it's just, you have to make your voice heard. I remember, again, the first TARP vote. Remember the Bush administration after the financial crisis. He wanted, the $800 billion bailout for all the big banks and the behemoth companies. And emails came in. I was up in Congress at the time. No, no, no. The House voted it down. It's just stunned everybody. So I want to encourage you not to think that your one voice, one vote doesn't count. It does. Now let me get to the war power, because that's really, really, really very important. And I need to at least make some background to know how flagrant and ominous the current situation is. When the framers drafted the Constitution in 1787, they were unanimous. Everyone, even Alexander Hamilton, who was in favor of a lifetime president, said, we can never, ever give the war power to the president. All history showed executive branches make up excuses to war because they get all the power, the secrecy, footprints in the hands of time, they build monuments to them and everything else. 100% of them. George Washington presided over the convention, and he wrote as president, I cannot use the military offensively unless Congress has deliberated and said yes. That was the clear understanding of the war power. No dissent. Anybody who believes in originalism can't possibly think they're presidential wars. Anyway, as we grew from a little acorn into a huge giant oak, we decided we didn't want to resist the temptation to bestride the world like a colossus, and so we need to have a Caesar to run an empire, so the heck we can't have the war power anymore to the Congress. And it found its fullest expression in modern times with the Korean War, where Harry Truman said, this is a police action in Korea. I don't need to go to Congress to get a declaration of war. Police action? 3 million Chinese soldiers were almost risking nuclear weapons. Yalu River that MacArthur wants to go across, that's not a war. Nothing happens. Congress does nothing. No impeachment, zero. And since that time, the presidents have routinely usurped the war power. They've done it occasionally because Congress, in their invertebrate status, passes something like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution saying, well, Mr. President, if you want to go to war, it's up to you. But don't blame us, right? And then even when they repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution under Nixon, he says, I'm going to fight the war anyway, and Congress shrugs its shoulders. So we've had this very, very long period of time, almost 8 decades, where it just become a custom for people to grow up thinking the president gets to go to war if he feels like it. That's it. Not a single president has ever said the War Powers Resolution is constitutional. Not one. They all say to the extent we pay any attention to it all, it's voluntary, cooperative, but we can ignore it if we wish. And now we come to the situation where President Biden unilaterally says, okay, we're going to send the THAAD defense missiles to Israel. We're going to have at least start out with 100. Remember mission creep, the advisors that we had in Vietnam? And what's the purpose? It's to be a co-combatant with Israel in anticipation of what it said is going to be an attack on Iran, a country with which we are not at war. You have to have a congressional declaration of war if we're working in partnership with a country that's going to attack another, and this is going to be helping their attack. Congress says nothing. It isn't even in the debate. Has Trump been asked about it? No. Kamala Harris? No. Any candidate ever? Vice presidents? No. It doesn't even come up. I mean, it's truly stunning to me. The war power is the central function we have to keep the country at peace and not go to war and have people die for nothing. And we don't even have a conversation about it. And when you have something as flagrant, it's Joe Biden, who in 2007, and Chris Matthews, he shouts himself on Hardball. He says, I am going to impeach George W. Bush if he goes to attack Iran without a congressional declaration. He does the same thing. He says he doesn't even blink an eye. So I've written, it's not because he loves the Constitution less, but that he loves power more, that he decided to change his mind. Really? Anyway, that's where we are. But ladies and gentlemen, that's why it's only going to change if you write in and say this is totally unacceptable. Congress is an invertebrate branch. Unless you call and scream at them, they are going to do nothing. They have done nothing for 80 years, and it's not going to change unless we change them.
Yes. On that note, some of us are in Congress every single day trying to get them to do something. And where I see that we've had our worst failure is getting Republicans, with the exception of Tom Massey. It is amazing that we can't get Republicans to criticize the Biden administration, and think how much worse it will be if Trump is in office. So I wonder, why is it so hard to get the same Republicans who are criticizing the money going to Ukraine to criticize money going to Israel? And I just want to throw in two factors that I see. One is not just the Jewish Zionist factor, but the Christian Zionist seems so important. Trump said when he was campaigning in 2015, he first realized that when he said something about loving Israel, the crowd went wild. And these were Christian crowds in Iowa and the Midwest and that kind of thing. And the last thing I just wanted to say is, how powerful is the lobby of the weapons contractors? And did you see that while you were in the State Department? And how much does that, is that a factor in trying to change the policy towards Israel?
Thanks, Medea, and thank you for all your work. Yeah, no, I think that there really is a tough question, right? Because when you think about parties that run on the American national interest, that tends to be the domain of the Republicans, right? At least for the last 40 years, that has been very much the Republican line. And you can even look at Republicans on the libertarian wing of the party, like Senator Rand Paul, who is very strong on America not getting involved in overseas conflicts, on not selling weapons to human rights violators, with one exception. And it is, I think, very frustrating. I think part of it, you said that it will get worse under President Trump, and I'm actually not sure that's the case in terms of the Republican Party itself. I actually think that with if there is a Trump presidency, there is actually a fair amount of divergence within the Republican Party that will play itself out in a way that it is not while they don't have the presidency. I don't know if we'll see that scenario or the Harris scenario, but it's worth noting. And I think there are voices in the Republican Party, whether as libertarians, whether as America Firsters who are concerned about foreign influence, whether as even fiscal conservatives who wonder if this is a best use of our money to send in this year alone, $20 billion at a time when survivors of Hurricane Helene are getting $750. And so I think that there are constituencies within the Republican Party. I do think that there is a captive sort of center, or not center, but sort of leadership right now that is being, sort of certainly influenced both by business interests, by sunk costs, and by, the Kufi lobby and Christian Zionism. But I also think that they are increasingly disconnected from their own base. And I think if you talk to an increasing number of Republican voters, you will hear a lot of the same concerns we've been talking about today, both in terms of lawlessness and in terms of what are our actual interests, what are our fiscal priorities. And so I do think change is coming there as well. But it is going to be measured, I think, on a different time scale, perhaps, than on the Democratic side. And then, second part of your question, sorry, I've already forgotten it. I should take notes while you're... Oh, the arms lobby, yeah. So, I mean, when I was working in the State Department, I did hear all the time and, work closely with particularly the major arms companies and their lobbyists. My experience was that, by and large, they didn't directly influence our foreign policy, our military policy, but boy, could they push us arms sale through. And once that arms sale is through, once a country is flying, F-35s or F-16s, and we have that budding defense relationship, we're certainly more likely to, A, do more trade with that country, but also to participate in more conflict alongside that country. But I think we also have to remember that by far the major customer for the arms industry is our own Department of Defense, by far. And DoD remains the major driver of the defense industry and of what they design and build. And so I think the foreign arms sales piece of this for the defense industry is a lower priority than getting the US government itself to spend. And what we do provide to other countries is really a drop in the bucket, right? So most countries are spending their own dollars on our weapons. We provide in a typical year, and the last couple of years with Ukraine and Israel have not been typical, but in a typical year, about $15 to $20 billion in support to other countries to buy American weapons. That sounds like a lot, but again, it's a drop in the bucket of the overall defense budget. So I think really they are mostly focused inwards, and to the extent they are focused outwards, they tend to be pushing individual sales rather than trying to drag us into a deep war or partnership.
Okay. Hi. Okay, Augustus Alzona, Asian Pacific American immigrant, Council of Trent Catholic. So those of you with the political and religious IQ above, certainly genius level or above, we've had our issues with the Jews and Protestants since the Council of Trent. But getting to the issue of these times, first of all, congratulations to all three of you. I think if anybody should be, group should be, get the next Nobel Peace Prize, it should be you guys. Okay, saying predicting that ahead of time, and as we are on the verge of World War III, possibly thermonuclear war, which would really screw up things for all of us, both sides of all the issues. My question is this: what would any of you do, whoever cares to do this, if you were the next president of the United States in terms of the Palestinian issue?
I mean, yeah. Go ahead, Bruce.
I go back to George Washington's farewell address. I think that the Constitution's foreign policy is invincible self-defense. We, by example and moral suasion, wish freedom and independence abroad, but otherwise we stay neutral, knowing that if we go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, even if for benign purposes, we will destroy ourselves, which is exactly what we've done. It's not going to make the world perfect. I don't know whether we have an answer for how to resolve a problem that's festered for thousands of years. We know Jesus delivered his Sermon on the Mount, the blood-stained area of all of Palestine. Jesus couldn't resolve it. I don't know whether we think that we're superior to him and trying to bring peace to that area. But I do know that because of we live in the United States, you know, we have to do the best we can. And history shows when we provide example, we can influence abroad more than all the arms in the world. We provoked the French Revolution with our Declaration of Independence and Constitution without a single bullet. We had like 6 rowboats. The French got the ideas and they acted accordingly. Because at least at that time we're subscribing to the Constitution. Despite its flaws, we still had slavery and other things. So is it a happy answer? No, it isn't, because there isn't any happy solution to something that's festered for thousands of years. But at least it gives us an example, and we're no longer complicit in war crimes and genocide, which I find completely unacceptable.
Bruce, the question was, if you were president,
No,
you would force it on Congress. You'd force them to vote for a declaration of war, right?
Exactly. We wouldn't listen. Congress will not be aggressive. The president doesn't ask for this stuff. Congress isn't going to do this on its own. It never has. Every single war that we ever began by presidents saying, I want the declaration of war. Congress never initiates it. They use words that suggest they're bombastic, whatever, require them to vote. Hasn't happened in 235 years. It's not going to happen now. Even when people like Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz won't vote for a war against Syria, that shows you how timid the Congress is when it comes to voting on this issue. And that's what the framers understood. That's why they entrusted
what you would do, right, is you would force Congress to vote for a declaration of war.
If they want, I wouldn't ask for it.
You would force, right?
Otherwise,
And they wouldn't do it.
No, of course they wouldn't. They would never.
You would force them.
Yeah, and then they would never take they would never even take the issue up. As they say, when Barack Obama asked Congress to declare war in 2013, it didn't even get a floor vote. Didn't even get out of committee. They'll kill it.
If I can just take a quick stab at that question as well. I recognize we're out of time, but I think, first of all, we have to recognize that there are limits even on the presidency right now in political terms, and that the problem we face here is such that even if a president was to be elected in 2 weeks' time and show up on January 20th and say, we're cutting all ties, it wouldn't happen. Congress would impeach them, but there would be laws passed. I mean, the problem we face is going to take a lengthy time of political renewal and addressing and energy to really shift the needle here. That said, one thing a president can do and could do tomorrow is follow the damn law, right? And as a bare minimum, whatever your policies are, whatever you think our alliances should look like, we have laws in this country, and they should be enforced.
Thank you, Josh.